Hello and welcome. Putting together a list of favorites is not an easy thing to do. Like with music or movies, what I consider to be the best depends on my mood, and it changes on any given day. Not to mention, no matter how long I spend curating and refining this list, I know there's something I'm going to forget. For better or for worse, these are some of my top choices. They represent titles that have stuck with me through the years and probably influenced me in various ways. They are some of the best the medium has to offer. Okay, let's commit this to video. Through the Habitrails by Jeff Nicholson is a profound piece of work that I personally identify with on many levels. Whenever I'm asked what independent graphic novel to read, this always comes to mind. It's a series of short stories that detail the career and life of the unnamed protagonist, who works as a graphic designer. The office where he works is lined with clear plastic Habitrails containing gerbils. Not only do these gerbils feed off the misery of the workers, but they are also subject to the violent outbursts of the workers. Every day, the protagonist is approached from behind and has a tap inserted into his head by a shadowy figure. His creativity, his personality, his essence is slowly drained out and fed to the gerbils. To cope with this level of unreality, the protagonist drinks heavily, escapes on long hiking trips, and he becomes involved with women he seems to have nothing but contempt for. He's clearly a self-destructive mess of pain and rage. All of these events culminate in a final solution, assisted and guided by an entity known as the Gerbil King. He minimizes his existence to complete nothingness, and then into oblivion. What makes this piece work is it's an unflinching look at the protagonist. His intentions are self-involved, and he engages in some questionable behavior throughout the series, which gives the story a level of honesty that is both disturbing and refreshing. For those that are familiar with despair, melancholy, and working in a strange environment, I think you'll enjoy Through the Habitrails. These two works have to be included, and they have to be mentioned together. They came out at roughly the same time, and, for better or for worse, they changed the medium and the perception of the medium. Both have been infinitely evaluated by everyone who covers comics. In modern times, it's not uncommon to hear they're flawed and not as good as history remembers. I beg to differ. Oh, certainly, they have flaws, and of course, their appeal is based on one's tastes. However, at the time they were released, their impact was incredible. They rightfully earned their place in comic book history. It seems to me, and this is my old man get off my lawn moment, if you weren't around when these were released, then you have no idea how big of a deal both were at the time. You're late to the party, and you have no idea how amazing the party was before you got there. This is why I have to include them on this list. They are far too significant to overlook. Hi, this is Alan, the voice of Strange Brain Parts. Sorry for the interruption, but I'll make this as brief as possible. Please subscribe and support this channel on Patreon. Links are down below. Thank you. Now back to the video. Surprise, surprise! A series I've covered in depth over many years is one of my top choices. But you'll note, it comes with an asterisk. Because this 300-issue series shifts focus after issue 200, and it's difficult to read further without feeling like you're agreeing with the point of view of the creator. Until that point, it's a reasonably coherent epic that evolves out of very humble beginnings. Had it not become a self-absorbed justification for one really bad opinion, the series would have achieved classic must-read status. There would be numerous video essays analyzing the techniques, themes, and the artistic achievement it represents, all of which are hard to acknowledge without a huge disclaimer to avoid the appearance of endorsing the worst aspects of it. Anyway, there's like 3 or so hours worth of video on this channel about Cerebus. Go watch them. That should give you the reasons why it's on the list. I tried to select one title for this entry, but found it too hard to do. That's because there are, technically, 3 pieces of work by Chester Brown that are great for 3 completely different reasons. The first is the series Yummy Fur. It was an anthology of surreal, sometimes challenging stories that evolved into an autobiographical look at Brown's early life. In some ways, Brown is a slightly detached version of Robert Crumb. Much of Brown's work is personal, but it's very objective. It's like Brown is completely outside his own experiences, and he's able to view them without emotion or judgment. He simply documents without much commentary. That's an approach to autobiographical work that may be unique to Brown. Out of Yummy Fur came the graphic novel Ed the Happy Clown, which is probably the best example of his surreal experimentation and how Brown literally pieced together a story one panel at a time without a direction in mind. The most recent editions have material added and taken out to give it a solid narrative flow. It's not a happy or comfortable story. It's high weirdness that, in my opinion, only works in comics. Then there's Louis Riel, a look at the life of the controversial Canadian figure. In some parts of Canada, such as Saskatchewan and Manitoba, he is a hero who fought for Indigenous rights. Others see him as a delusional revolutionary who attempted to overthrow the government and, in the end, was executed for treason. There's a fair amount written about Riel. Depending on the focus of the material, he's either heroic or a misguided individual with delusions of grandeur. Brown's examination is, yet again, a highly objective piece that incorporates both opinions into one cohesive narrative. At the same time, it documents the racism and devious machinations of Canada's earliest government figures. So it's not a feel-good piece, but it's an important piece of history all Canadians should read about. And it shows the rest of the world that Canada's friendly reputation has some very dark undertones. Grendel, by Matt Wagner and various artists, was one of the first independent titles I discovered. I thought, from looking at the cover, that it was superhero-related, but it really wasn't. It took a few years before it was revealed that Grendel was a timeless, malicious presence that overcame its host and inspired them to be self-centered and violent. It's a title that wasn't afraid of change and evolution, which was vastly different from most mainstream work, where the status quo was reset at the end of a story arc. Each Grendel, and their circumstances, is unique and engaging. There's a distinct mythology around Grendel that is deep and satisfying, especially during its original run. The revival and the works produced by others are all solid. However, in a general sense, they can be less satisfying, which may be because an ever-evolving concept seems less engaging if it holds its ground to expand on the current influence of Grendel. But with any rich concept, there's going to be a time when you reach a point where constant forward motion is difficult, so it's hard to be overly critical, and Wagner achieved more in 40 issues than most do in 100 or more. Currently, it appears that Wagner is finding a place to conclude this saga using the cyborg Grendel Prime. Or perhaps it's his final say on the topic, since he's closer to the end of his career than the beginning. So within the next few years, the Grendel saga may have a sense of closure. Another title with an asterisk. Alan Moore's breakthrough run on Swamp Thing is some really good horror reading. The notation is there because I believe Moore loses a lot of steam after issue 50. The work isn't terrible, but it reads like he's struggling to find a way to maintain interest. Moore hadn't done Watchmen or The Killing Joke yet, so his North American resume looked like a one-hit wonder type of thing. It may sound cynical, but in my opinion, he kept playing that Swamp Thing song until he had a few more hits. Swamp Thing is a definitive guide on how to take a character, develop them, and organically take them to new places to explore without undermining or throwing away their history. It doesn't retcon, it provides a different context, which I know sounds like a fancy way of saying the same thing. The difference is, a retcon reads like a cheap spin on a historical moment to say something that happened didn't really happen. A basic example would be a character death. Retconned it would be they, more often than not, escaped off panel. Within a different context, they die and then are transformed, like Alec Holland did. Additionally, there are consequences that are explored, which opens up the story even further. Again, that's a basic example of what Alan Moore did on Swamp Thing. Certainly, he did the same thing with Miracle Man and to some extent with Captain Britain. His work on both titles preceded the Muck Monster, so by the time he got around to Swamp Thing, he really knew what he was doing. And it shows. While there is work by Steve Gerber that is better, such as Howard the Duck, Fool Killer, and Hard Time, there's something about this story that just works for me. It's so weird and so absurd that it's hard to believe it was ever published by Marvel. This may be best exemplified by Elf with a Gun, who is a character that shot and killed random people for literally no reason. Sure, it was a subtle commentary about random violence and how it happens, but there's no resolution or even the suggestion it has any connection to the series of events happening in the comic. Anyway, the main story is an oddball, mind-swap story with an orphaned deer, fish-faced aliens, another alien who's a self-help guru, and Nighthawk's brain being carried around in a bowl. As the real stories go, it's on par with anything Grant Morrison did on Doom Patrol. Gerber flawlessly incorporated every whimsical plot element that occurred to him as he wrote it. So even though the story does eventually come together as a mostly coherent whole, it's an example of a writer pouring out his imagination onto the page and eventually making sense of the unrelated, quirky elements. Of all Grant Morrison's work, it's Animal Man that I find myself returning to time and again. This is because it's not weighed down with illusions and texture one has to wade through to unlock some hidden, arcane message. Like Doom Patrol, there's a low level of pretentiousness, and the story is a bit weird on a few levels, but in the end, it's rather straightforward. So yes, it may not be as complex as later work. However, ever-expanding complexity and rapidly hitting plot beats doesn't necessarily mean a better story. Which isn't to suggest Animal Man doesn't have a level of complexity, it certainly does. That said, the complexity is rather focused, and the layers don't read like distractions or deviations to disguise a basic plot. Like The Invisibles, which is a glorious disaster, Animal Man seemingly falls apart at the end. In fact, originally, I thought it was a cheap out, a way to sidestep a failure to plot a satisfying ending. But it isn't, in my opinion. Morrison displays a level of honesty and kindness to the fictional character, Buddy Baker, that seems non-existent in a lot of superhero work. There's some genuine empathy and regret at the cheap melodramatics utilized to entertain an audience, and ultimately, respect for Buddy and what he's forced to endure. If you dislike The Tick, then I pity you. I truly do. You probably have a very sad existence. As superhero parodies go, it's probably the best. Early on, it picks on Superman, before moving on to Daredevil and the ridiculous amount of ninja in popular culture. After that, it becomes its own thing, and starts expanding the silly world of superheroes and supervillains. It was so comedically strong, there's been 2 live-action TV series and a cartoon. Anyway, the comic series, written and illustrated by Ben Edlund, would only last 12 issues, spread out over 5 years, before it abruptly ended. It spawned a few slightly bizarre spin-offs, such as Paul the Samurai, Man-Eating Cow, and the Chainsaw Vigilante, all of which are dollar bin regulars. Sam and Max Freelance Police is a pure delight. It's no wonder it also had a brief cartoon series, although the cartoon was pretty tame in comparison to the comic. The comic is just infectious. Both characters are borderline psychotics that rampage through each story, trying to solve mysteries. It's wonderful madcap nonsense that moves at 1,000 miles per hour. It's terribly fun madness. Flaming Carrot is the best absurdist comic of all time. It's not something you read thinking you'll get a story. It's something you read to get a creative experience. In some ways, it's a title that's critic-proof, because trying to analyze it is a rabbit hole you'll never escape from. And before long, you'll be convinced it's a surreal manifesto that reveals the secrets of the universe. Maybe not this universe, but some universe nearby, possibly one that's 10 minutes into the future. Thank you for watching. Thanks to all my fine supporters on Patreon and YouTube. Your ongoing support makes it possible for this channel to continue. I appreciate every single one of you. Please subscribe if you've not already. Leave a comment and a like. I try to keep ads and self-promotional bits like this to a minimum, so if you can, consider directly supporting this channel on Patreon. Extra special thanks to Eidolon, Constant Disappointment Records, Jeff Nicholson, Sickin, Francis De La Cruz, Russell Bull, John Nyukes, Andrew Barton, Odin Ashcroft, Ruby St. Dennis, Phil Sagan, Edward Clayton Andrew, Corey Drew, L.S. Gregor, Brian Deaton, Tom Granis, John Gaunt, James Graham, and Matt Marino. You are all justified and ancient. Until next time.